3 days after I moved into that lakeside cabin, I realized somebody had been using my property like it belonged to them. By the end of that summer, a woman who called herself the guardian of the community was floating helplessly in circles on a lake while two sheriff's deputies stood beside me, trying not to laugh. And believe it or not, that wasn't even the strangest part of the story. My name is Ethan Mercer, and after 23 years in the Army, I thought retirement would finally be simple. I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't looking for conflict. And I sure as hell wasn't looking for another person who thought they had authority over my life. The cabin sat on the northern edge of Blackwater Lake, tucked behind a wall of pine trees that kept most of the world out. It had belonged to my uncle Raymond, a stubborn old Korean War veteran who spent the last 20 years of his life fishing, drinking terrible coffee, and arguing with television news anchors who couldn't hear him. When he passed away, he left the property to me. For nearly 3 years, I kept putting off the move. Part of me wasn't sure I knew how to live without noise. After enough deployments, enough alarms, enough nights sleeping with one eye open, silence starts feeling unfamiliar. But eventually I packed my truck, drove north, and disappeared. The first few days were perfect. The cabin needed work, sure. The porch leaned slightly to the left. The roof groaned whenever the wind picked up. Something had definitely died in the pantry at least once in the previous decade. But none of that mattered. Every morning I sat on the dock with a mug of coffee and watched the mist roll across the water. No phone calls, no schedules, no expectations. For the first time in a very long time, my shoulders relaxed. Then I found the footprints. At first it didn't seem important. A few prints near the shoreline. Some crushed beer cans behind a shed. A folding lawn chair sitting at the end of my dock. I stared at it for a while. I knew it wasn't mine. I didn't even own a chair like that. Somebody had been spending time on my property while nobody lived there. I figured it was local teenagers or tourists. The place had been empty for years. People probably assumed nobody cared. So I cleaned everything up and moved on. A few days later, I installed fresh signs. Private property. No trespassing. One sign simply said, "You are being recorded." That one tended to get people's attention. I thought that would solve the problem. I was wrong. A week later, I was replacing a crack board on the dock when I heard someone approaching down the gravel path. Now, after spending most of my adult life identifying potential problems before they became actual problems, you develop instincts. And every instinct I had immediately whispered the same thing. This person was about to be a headache. I looked up and saw a woman walking toward me. She appeared to be somewhere in her late 50s. Perfectly styled silver blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, expensive walking shoes, and tucked under one arm was a thick leather binder packed with papers. Not a notebook, not a folder, a full command center. She stopped a few feet away and smiled the kind of smile that somehow felt less friendly the longer you looked at it. "Good afternoon," she said. "Beautiful property." I nodded. "Thank you. I'm Valerie Stanton." There was a pause, the kind where she expected recognition. When none came, she continued. "I'm president of the Lakeshore Ridge Community Association." And just like that, I felt the first crack in my peaceful retirement. "Oh," I said. She smiled wider. "Yes, we've been meaning to speak with whoever moved into this cabin." I set my hammer down. "Well, now you've spoken to him." Her eyes drifted toward the dock, toward the shoreline, toward the lake, like a realtor mentally calculating value. "Wonderful," she said. "There are just a few community arrangements we should discuss." The way she said arrangements immediately made me suspicious. "What kind of arrangements?" She pointed toward the water. "The residents have traditionally enjoyed access to this section of shoreline." I blinked. "I'm sorry, access to my shoreline?" "Well, unofficially," she said, "for community gatherings, seasonal celebrations, family events. It's always been understood." I looked around, then back at her. "No offense, ma'am, but I don't remember agreeing to any of that." Her smile flickered, only for a second. "This property has been part of the community for years." "No, terapia." "This property has been next to the community for years." "That's different." The temperature of the conversation dropped immediately. Valerie adjusted her sunglasses. For the first time, her smile disappeared completely. "I think you'll find cooperation goes a long way around here, Mr. Mercer." I met her gaze. "And I think you'll find private property still means something around here." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she closed her binder. "Oh," she said softly. We'll see. She turned around and walked back toward the road. I watched her leave. Something told me that conversation wasn't over. Not even close. And standing there on that dock, watching her disappear behind the trees, I had no idea that the woman who had just introduced herself was about to turn my quiet retirement into the strangest battle of my entire life. Even stranger than anything I'd dealt with overseas. Because Valerie Stanton wasn't the type of person who accepted the word no. She was the type of person who treated no like the opening move of a negotiation. And unfortunately for both of us, I had spent most of my life refusing to surrender ground. Over the next few weeks, Valerie made it her personal mission to become impossible to ignore. At first, she kept things polite, or at least polite enough to maintain plausible deniability. Every few days, she'd appear somewhere near my property, carrying that oversized binder like it was a sacred text. Sometimes she'd stop while I was fishing. Sometimes while I was repairing the cabin. Sometimes she'd simply stand near the property line, pretending to admire the lake. Then the requests started. One afternoon, she informed me that the community's annual summer picnic usually took place near my dock. Another day, she explained that local families had traditionally used my shoreline for graduation photos. A week later, she suggested allowing access for a charity paddle event. Every request came wrapped in the same language. Community, tradition, cooperation. What she never seemed to understand was that none of those words magically transferred ownership. Eventually, I started keeping notes. Not because I needed evidence, because I needed entertainment. I bought a small notebook and labeled it Valerie Incident Reports. Entry number 1. Attempted emotional blackmail involving family picnic. Entry number 2. Suggested my dock could improve community morale. Entry number 3. Apparently my shoreline now supports local culture. I laughed every time I wrote in it, at least at first. Then things started escalating. One morning, I found a flyer taped to my gate advertising a neighborhood barbecue. Location, Mercer Lakefront Access Area. I stared at it for nearly 30 seconds. Then I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. Not only had nobody asked permission, they had actually renamed my property. That afternoon, I drove into town and bought stronger locks. A week later, I installed cameras, then motion sensors, then a remote monitoring system connected directly to my phone. Years of military service had taught me one simple lesson. Hope is not a security strategy. Preparation is. Around that same time, I finally completed a project I'd been working on for nearly 2 years. The boat. Now, most retired guys buy a fishing boat and call it a day. I went a slightly different direction. The vessel was 22 feet long, all electric, whisper quiet, and custom built from the hull up. I named her Phantom, not because she was flashy, because she was invisible. No engine roar, no smoke, no vibration, just smooth movement across the water. It became my favorite thing on the entire property. Some mornings I'd launch before sunrise and spend hours drifting across the lake watching the world wake up. For the first time in decades, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Contentment. Naturally, that's when Valerie discovered the boat. The first time she saw it, she practically froze. I was tying off the mooring lines when she appeared near the dock. Again, like a tax auditor summoned by bad luck. She stared at the boat for several seconds, then smiled, and that smile immediately made me nervous. "That's quite impressive," she said. "Thank you. New purchase." Retirement project. She slowly walked around it, examining everything. The electronics, the hull, the seating, the charging station. I didn't like how interested she seemed. Then she finally asked the question, "Have you ever considered sharing it with the community?" I blinked. "I'm sorry. The residents would absolutely love lake tours." "No," she laughed. Actually laughed, as if I made a joke. "I'm serious." "So am I." The smile disappeared. Again, that was becoming a pattern. "You know," she said, "people around here believe in contributing." I nodded. I contributed 23 years of my life already. I'm good. That ended the conversation. Or so I thought. A few days later, I noticed something strange. The visit stopped. No Valeria. No flyers. No unexpected conversations. Nothing. At first, it felt wonderful. Then it felt suspicious. People like Valerie don't simply disappear. They regroup. The silence lasted almost a week. And every day that passed made me more certain she was planning something. The funny thing is, after enough years dealing with difficult people, you start recognizing patterns. Most people tell you exactly who they are. You just have to listen. Valerie had spent weeks treating my property like a community resource. She treated ownership as an inconvenience, boundaries as suggestions, and my refusal as a personal insult, which meant eventually she would stop asking. She would simply take. The possibility bothered me enough that I activated a feature I'd installed on Phantom during construction. A security protocol. Nothing dangerous. Nothing illegal. Just effective. The system included GPS tracking, remote monitoring, biometric authentication, encrypted startup controls, and a backup operating mode designed specifically for unauthorized access. I'd built it mostly because I enjoyed technology, but part of me suspected it might eventually become useful. Turns out that instinct was right. The following Friday morning, I drove into town for supplies. About 15 minutes into the trip, my phone vibrated, then vibrated again, then again. 3 alerts in less than 30 seconds. Perimeter breach. Dock access detected. Unauthorized activity. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and opened the security app. The camera feed loaded instantly. And there she was, Valerie Stanton. No binder. No community smile. No fake professionalism. Just Valerie, wearing jeans, gloves, and a gray sweatshirt, sneaking down my dock like a teenager trying to steal beer from a convenience store. For a moment, I honestly couldn't believe what I was seeing. Then she climbed aboard Phantom. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was so incredibly predictable. The woman had spent weeks acting like she owned the lake. Now she was helping herself to my boat. She sat in the captain's seat, pressed several buttons, looked confused, pressed more buttons. Then finally she found the startup sequence. The display activated, the electric motors engaged, and Phantom quietly pulled away from the dock. For approximately 7 seconds, everything looked normal. Then the security system recognized the lack of authorization, and backup mode activated. I leaned back against my truck and watched the camera feed. The boat began turning slowly. Then again. A smooth control pattern. Wide looping arcs across the middle of the lake. Valerie grabbed the controls. Nothing happened. She pressed buttons. Nothing happened. She stood up, looked around, sat back down, pressed more buttons. Still nothing. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. Lock control authority and place the vessel into a safe automated holding pattern until manually reset by the owner. Watching her realize she wasn't actually driving the boat anymore was one of the most satisfying things I've ever seen. She spun around, checked the dashboard, checked the shoreline, checked the controls again. Meanwhile, Phantom continued tracing elegant loops across the water like it didn't have a care in the world. That's why I made a phone call. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, because at that point the situation had become a criminal matter. So I contacted the sheriff's department. I explained exactly what had happened. I informed them I had video footage, GPS records, and real-time monitoring. The dispatcher listened quietly, then asked one question. Is the woman in danger? I looked at the screen. Valerie was currently shaking the steering wheel as if intimidation might help. No, I said, just extremely committed to making bad decisions. Then I turned the truck around and started driving home, because something told me the next hour was going to be unforgettable. By the time I reached the cabin, Phantom had been carrying Valerie around the lake for nearly 40 minutes. I parked the truck, grabbed a folding chair from the porch, pulled a cold root beer from the cooler, and walked down to the dock. A very expensive lesson. For a second, he just stood there. Then he laughed despite himself. A second deputy joined him while I showed them the footage, security alerts, GPS records, and access logs. Every timestamp lined up perfectly. Every camera angle told the same story. Unauthorized entry. Unauthorized boat operation. Unauthorized departure. The evidence wasn't just solid. It was overwhelming. About 10 minutes later, Phantom automatically began returning toward the dock. The deputies watched quietly. The boat glided across the water like nothing unusual had happened. Then it eased gently into position. Valerie stood up, attempted to step onto the dock, missed completely, and collapsed into a heap of embarrassment and frustration. The deputies helped her to her feet. Her hair was a mess. Her sweatshirt was twisted sideways, and her expression looked like someone had personally betrayed her understanding of reality. What he did was dangerous, she snapped. Deputy Cole looked at the boat, then at me, then back at her. Ma'am, did he invite you onto the vessel? No. Did you have permission? No. Did you enter private property? Valerie opened her mouth, then closed it. That was probably the smartest thing she'd done all day. The sheriff's department completed their report and left. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, a process server knocked on my door. Valerie was suing me. Apparently, I had caused emotional trauma, psychological distress, public humiliation, and my personal favorite, technological recklessness. I actually laughed while reading it. Then I called my attorney. Her name was Claire Donovan, former military lawyer, sharp enough to cut glass. When she read the complaint, she smiled the way sharks probably smile when they smell blood in the water. The mediation meeting happened 2 weeks later. Valerie arrived with an attorney who looked like he spent more money on hair products than legal research. Claire arrived carrying 3 boxes. Actual boxes. The mediator immediately looked concerned. For nearly 2 hours, Claire methodically dismantled every argument they presented. Security footage, property records, access logs, survey maps, ownership documents, warning signs, camera timestamps, everything. Then she introduced the final piece, a video recording from several weeks earlier. Valerie, standing on my dock. Valerie saying, very clearly, this property isn't technically part of the association. The room became very quiet. Her attorney looked horrified. Claire looked delighted. And I sat there drinking coffee, trying not to grin. The case was dismissed shortly afterward. But something interesting happened during the process. Because lawsuits create attention. Attention creates questions. And questions often uncover things people would rather keep hidden. Within weeks, residents throughout Lakeshore Ridge started sharing stories. Apparently, Valerie had developed a reputation. There had been disputes, complaints, power struggles, unauthorized decisions. One neighbor claimed she'd attempted to relocate a property boundary marker because she didn't like where it was. Another claimed she'd organized landscaping work in somebody else's yard without permission. The stories kept coming, and once people started talking, they didn't stop. A petition circulated, then another, then a vote. 3 months after she boarded my boat, Valerie Stanton lost her position as HOA president. The vote wasn't even close. A few days later, I received a handwritten letter. No return address. Inside was a short note. Mr. Mercer, you may never realize how many people were afraid to stand up to her. Thank you for finally doing it. Enjoy the lake. I laughed when I read it, not because I felt victorious. Honestly, I mostly felt relieved. The following month, a for sale sign appeared in Valerie's yard. 2 weeks later, the house was empty. And just like that, she was gone. No dramatic forward. No final confrontation. Not even scheme. Just silence. The kind I've been looking for all along. The lake settled back into its normal rhythm. The seasons changed. Summer faded into fall. The trees turned gold and red. The mornings became colder. And for the first time since moving there, life became exactly what I'd wanted. Simple, peaceful, mine. I spent my days fishing, working on small projects around the cabin, taking Phantom out on sunrise cruises. Sometimes I'd sit on the dock for hours doing absolutely nothing. And surprisingly, that turned out to be enough. One evening, several months later, I heard scratching outside the front door. Now old habits die hard. A lifetime of military service teaches you to investigate unusual sounds. So I opened the door carefully and found a raccoon sitting on my porch. The little thief looked up at me. I looked down at him. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he reached over and knocked my beer off the railing. I stared at him. He stared back. I sighed. Great. The raccoon didn't seem impressed. He came back the next day. Then the day after that. Eventually, I started leaving scraps out for him. Not because I wanted a pet, because resistance was clearly futile. I named him Walter. Walter never trespassed with legal paperwork, never demanded community access, never filed complaints. He simply appeared, stole whatever food wasn't nailed down, and left. Honestly, that made him one of the better neighbors I'd ever had. Nowadays, life is quiet. The cabin feels like home. The lake feels like peace. And every evening when the sun starts dropping behind the trees, Phantom sits tied safely at the dock while Walter patrols the yard like a tiny furry security consultant. Sometimes people ask whether I miss civilization. The neighborhoods, the meetings, The communities. I always give them the same answer. Not particularly, because after everything that happened, I learned something important. A peaceful life isn't about finding the perfect place. It's about protecting the boundaries that allow peace to exist in the first place. And maybe that's where I'd like to leave this story, because I'm genuinely curious what you think. Was Valerie simply trying to protect her community and took things too far? Or was she the kind of person who believed every boundary existed for everyone except herself? If someone repeatedly ignored your property rights in the name of community, where would you draw the line? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who refused to take no for an answer, I'd love to hear your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.